Welcome to this week's episode of Accredited Investor Markets Radio. Each week, we speak with you about investing in alternative assets. Unbiased and beholden to no one, Accredited Investor Markets Radio does not accept advertising from any investment firm or financial advisor. Accredited Investor Markets Radio is the spoken word sister of AccreditedInvestorMarkets.com, the internet's most comprehensive and unbiased educational resource about crowdfunding, angel investing, venture capital, private equity, private shares, and other investment classes beyond publicly traded stocks and bonds.
Hello, welcome to Accredited Investor Markets Radio. I am your host, Christopher Cahill. Our guest today, a little bit later on, will be Jerry Mills, founder of B2B CFO. But before we get to the Jerry Mills interview, a few observations about security, cyber security. Now maybe you were like me and you got a little bit tied up in the Target security breach last holiday season. I had to go get a new debit card. Well, JP Morgan, more recently, had a security breach in which information concerning 83 million individuals and small businesses was taken away from the company, names, addresses, phone numbers, and email addresses. Of course, Home Depot had a recent rather large security breach. Well, the very helpful website privco.com, Privco.com, notes that while through May of 2014, early-stage investment in cybersecurity startups was up a great deal, 69%, year-on-year through the more recent period, actually year-on-year investment has fallen, which might sound a little peculiar. But don't let that make you think that cybersecurity has receded as a matter of importance. Immediately when one reads the headlines about large public companies having cybersecurity breaches, well, at least a lawyer or a financial professional, or maybe all of us start thinking, oh, wait a minute, aren't these public companies going to have to report on the level of their cyber readiness? Are they going to have to report on the level of their cyber breach insurance coverage? Well, more recently, on October 29th, an article by Susan Barlin in Reuters.com entitled Wall Street Watchdog to Bolster Reviews of Brokerage Cybersecurity answers those questions. Yes, large public companies and banks are going to have to make these kinds of representations in their public offerings and their public filings, or at least make these kinds of disclosures to the regulators. The Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, FINRA, is developing examination priorities that include cybersecurity. The regulator is hiring examiners with technology expertise to assist in reviewing firm practices. FINRA expects to be examining measures that firms have in place for securing clients' data and testing the integrity of firms' technology. The Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association, SIFMA, as opposed to FINRA, which is Wall Street's top trade group, has called for the creation of a new interagency working group of regulators and the White House that would be charged with developing consistent cybersecurity rules for the financial industry. It sounds like a great way for a lot of people to get jobs, assuming we can get enough tech people to fill those jobs. But it is a very real problem. There's no question about that. On October 27th, a related article was filed in the website Law 360, written by Allison Grande, entitled New York Cybersecurity Push Turns Up the Heat on Law Firms. Yes. In Henry VI, Dick the Butcher says famously, the first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. Well, obviously that's going too far. But maybe we can sue them. The New York State Department of Financial Services, as reported in the Law 360 article, has issued a letter which encourages law firms to develop robust data security practices and take steps to assure that sensitive client data is secure. Well, that does make a certain amount of sense, doesn't it? Law firms are a major vendor to banks, they're a major vendor to other large public companies, and you can understand how they would be a weak link, security-wise, in particular, when attorneys log in remotely. And everything I've just said, of course, could apply to accountants as well as consultants, and everything I'm about to say could apply to accountants and consultants as vendors to banks and large public companies. Evidently, there's a certification under the International Organization for Standardization, which is very difficult and time-consuming to meet, but which a number of very large law firms are meeting in order to maintain their relationships with very large clients. Now, if you think about that for a minute, that is going to place large law firms at a competitive advantage over smaller or boutique vendors. In his letter, the New York Superintendent of Financial Services revealed that his department was considering requiring banks to go even further and to have the banks be required to get representations and warranties from lawyers and other third-party service providers. So this puts lawyers on the hook. Again, let's not kill all the lawyers, but let's sue them. Of course, by making lawyers do those sorts of things, maybe the law firms will take greater steps. Stanley Orzula, Quarles and Brady LLP partner, is quoted in the article as saying, the ideas of representations and warranties is a hard one because you're basically saying your system is secure no matter what happens. But with ever-evolving cyber threats that are changing daily, that's hard to do. Well, I have to agree with Mr. Orzula. And my last comment on the article, my last piece of data to draw from it, is that the New York State Department of Financial Services Superintendent is also urging banks to detail any and all protections against loss, that is insurance. So we have to get used to this brave new world of cybersecurity, cyber readiness, and different ways in which countermeasures can be taken. And most importantly, how do you protect against loss and who takes the loss when loss comes? Well, that's enough from me. Let's get to our guest. Today we have with us Jerry Mills. Jerry Mills is the author of several business books. He's a public speaker and the founder of B2B CFO, the nation's largest chief financial services and exit strategies firm. He has more than 30 years of business experience. In 2013, Jerry released a book called the Exit Strategy Handbook, which is now in its second edition. It is the first exit strategy book to also feature a digital dashboard component. I'm going to ask you about that, Jerry. Allowing business owners to track the progress of preparing their company for sale through a series of organized and easy-to-follow steps. Now, of course, this program will not be about selling companies, but rather about how investors should regard the process and can get involved. Jerry, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and the digital dashboard?
Yeah, well, briefly, I graduated from Arizona State University with a degree in accounting. I worked for several years at Arthur Andersen. I was a manager, an experienced manager with the firm. That's where I came up with this concept of B2B CFO and started the company in 78. And there were two of us in the company in 2002. Now there's about 220, and we expect the company to grow exponentially. So that's a little bit about me. Our dashboard software, one of the unique features about it is the first time something, Chris, has been written like this. In my experience in going through transactions with business owners, they usually, through the transaction, feel like they lose control. They feel that, they see other people doing work. They see attorneys. They see M&A firms, private equity companies, appraisers, PAs, all doing things, but they feel somewhat out of control during the process. And so this software has been built to give them that control. They can see on a dashboard where their company is in the process of the exit strategy, and they can see it from their iPhone, their iPad, anywhere they're traveling. They can see who's past due on a project. They can see the value of their company, the increased value of the company since we started. So it's really cool software in terms of looking at it from a business owner's point of view of finally having a tool to have control of the process. It has a patent pending on it right now. We feel that there's a good chance in the first quarter of next year we'll actually have a patent from the USPTO on it. And we're pretty excited about the dashboard software.
Okay, and I guess a simple-minded observation is that business owners who've been running a business now for a generation or less even, they're not in the business of selling businesses, and suddenly they're a swarm with different concerns and different professionals and semi-professionals and all kinds of inquiries coming in from potential purchasers and other interested parties. And I suppose this dashboard helps them control their own environment and to respond adequately to all these people.
That's exactly right. It can be very frustrating to them. And what's interesting, business owners don't always contrary to myth, they don't always sell to the highest price. We had a sale happen last year. It was actually I think the second lowest price, but the employees were going to be taken care of. So the business owner has just a lot of concerns while going through this process. So the dashboard is there to just control so they can really focus on other things other than the minutia and just to feel in control. It's a company, so it should be in control of the process. So that's why that dashboard software has been written.
Well, all right. Turning then to the investor perspective, because actually I guess our focus today is investor opportunities and investor perspectives toward the kinds of businesses we're talking about, which are small to mid-sized, privately held, often closely held businesses. And of those, you have coined a term, and that term is the Baby Boomer Tsunami. Can you explain that term, please?
Oh, yes, I'd be glad to. Well, we all know what a tsunami is. When a tsunami is coming, there isn't much you can do. And actually, in my book, I have written about several of the most infamous tsunamis in the history of mankind. And we're going to be hitting a tsunami, and there isn't anything we can do about it. It's just going to hit. And that tsunami is no secret. There are 78 baby boomers that are going to be retiring. One of the interesting things about this large number is this has never happened in the history of mankind in terms of the volume. One author that I researched estimated that these baby boomers own about 12 million businesses. There's been sort of a generational change. It used to be 20, 30, 40 years ago that these baby boomers would turn most of these businesses over to their children, but the children, baby boomers don't want to take over their parents' businesses. They want to do something else.
That's a form of justice, isn't it? I mean, the baby boomer generation was very good at not doing what their parents wanted to do, and then these ones have built, 78 million of them have built 12 million businesses, and these are a number of these, and it's a large number no matter how you slice it, are going to come online as sale or purchase opportunities, I guess is where we're going, right?
Yeah, what's interesting in my research, Capital IQ, which is the biggest source for these types of transactions, disclosed that between 2007 and 2012, there were about 8,000 privately held businesses closed a year on average during that period of time. Well, if you look at the number of businesses that baby boomers are going to add to the market, on average they're going to add about 364,000 companies a year on top of those 8,000.
Whoa.
And so we're going through something that has never happened before just because of the volume, just the size of the volume, because the baby boomers have to do something. They're going to retire, they're going to sell their business, something's going to happen to the business. That's why we call it the tsunami, because it's just so huge in terms of the volume.
Yes, and a tsunami can be a very dreadful thing, or it can provide some great waves for those who like to surf. We also have new developments, of course, otherwise, which is that accredited investors have more access to more deals than they used to put it very vaguely, under the new Jobs Act. So these accredited investors, what opportunities does the baby boomer tsunami present to them? And how should they begin to prepare?
Well, some of these numbers are correct. It's highly likely that in certain industries there's going to be a lot of businesses for sale that normally weren't up for sale. Let's say, for example, in the past that in a specific industry there were 2 or 3 companies for sale. Now there might be 10 to 12. And so it's highly likely that it's going to turn to a buyer's market because they have more opportunities. And there may be opportunities to buy businesses on a discounted price. These baby boomers, they've got to do something. Again, their children or family members aren't going to take over the business. If investors are smart about their research and they're doing the proper research, they just may find companies at a discounted price, the companies that are very operational, produce a lot of good working capital at a discounted price. So there may be an opportunity in the future just because of the volume that's going to be hitting the market.
Well, let's just turn away from the idea of opportunity to perhaps false opportunities, because I was beguiled by the title of a book you wrote, not the one we're talking about, but an earlier book. The title of it is Avoid the Danger Zone, Business Illusions. And that made me think, well, you don't want to invest or purchase or invest in the purchase or invest in a group that invests in the purchases of companies that have indulged in illusions. So what illusions possibly indulged in by a seller business should investors watch for?
That's a great question. There are several of them I'll mention, and they're not in a particular order of hierarchy or priority, but for example, it may be an illusion if you buy a company that the key customers will stay with the new buyer.
Yes.
That relationship may be with the former owner-manager of the company, and there's nothing, I wouldn't say nothing, but that's a significant risk to buy a company, assume that the key customers are going to stay with the new buyer, and then they go to somebody else.
Similarly, if I may interject, there are some industries, aren't there, like perhaps selling packaged food, in which customer loyalty is not, you cannot count on it as much as you can in other industries because it's so easy to switch to another provider.
Mm-hmm,
yeah,
exactly. But that's an illusion to assume that the customers are going to stay the same. Another one, key vendors. Sometimes they have sweet deals with the owner because they've known them for years. They cut them some discounts. They have favorable terms or treatment. Well, the key vendors with a new buyer may not keep those discounts or favorable treatment, and that may cause cost of goods sold or services to go up. And that's something that the investor needs to know about, and that's something they've got to nail down before the transaction closes, that those key customers and vendors are going to continue doing business in the favorable way they were before.
Oh, well, yeah, that sounds wise indeed. And as long as we're at it, are there any other due diligence tips an investor might want to keep at the front of his or her brain when it comes to these closely held or privately held businesses that are going to come online, or at least that are going to become sellable in the next few years?
Yeah, a few that may not be readily apparent. It's not surprising that today a lot of companies have a variety of software applications, sometimes from Oracle or Microsoft or whatever. And it's surprising how many times, and a lot of times the owner doesn't even know this because they have an IT manager or they have employees doing things. The question that the investor wants to know is all the software that I'm going to buy licensed? Is it properly licensed? Or am I going to buy a company and find out that it's basically been pirated, and now I have to fork over more money to purchase the licenses for the software? That's a huge one. Another one deals with intellectual property. It's surprising how many times a business owner will say, no, and they're not doing this out of deceit. They're saying this because they think that they own title to intellectual property. I'm talking about trademarks, patents, URLs, and so forth. And it's very interesting, Chris, how many times they really do not own, because they don't understand a lot of the IP issues, because they're not in the business of IP, intellectual property.
Well, I'll tell you if I may interrupt again. My day job is as an insolvency lawyer, and so I'm involved in bankruptcy cases, and this is certainly the case with failing businesses or struggling businesses. They haven't kept track or don't know what the license situation is, what the ownership situation is with IP. And there's no reason to think that a succeeding business is necessarily any better at that. You know, biz people, entrepreneurs, they build. They're not battening down the intellectual property hatches every time they turn around. Isn't that correct?
That's exactly right. And they don't know a lot of the rules. They don't need to know. They just need to hire a good attorney to make sure. But do they have a trademark, or is it a 1A supplemental trademark? Well, there's a significant difference between owning a trademark and having a 1A supplemental. That's easily discoverable by a good attorney, and it could significantly impact an investor who thinks he or she is buying the company because there's a certain amount of IP, and that they don't own it. Well, that's a risk that they need to address, and it can be nailed down, but it just takes hiring some good attorneys who know a lot about that issue. Another one, financial statements. Sometimes they're accurate. A lot of times they're not. A lot of times there are personal items buried in the P&L or income statement, profit and balance sheet, and so forth. And in another one, assets. Are they properly insured? It's amazing how many times a buyer may think, because they're told, that they have proper insurance on all the assets. Well, you buy something, a business, and the building burns down, the equipment is destroyed, an employee steals cash or other equipment. Well, if it's not insured, the buyer's taking the risk on those issues, right? And these are things that I'm telling you, this is not a holistic list, but they're things that are very important that investors typically don't think about. They usually have their mind on other things. So these are some of the key illusions. You ask about illusions that I've seen during my career.
Yeah. Well, so long as you brought up attorneys, for obvious reasons, investors, like everybody else, they don't want to talk to lawyers unless they have to. Nobody does. I don't want to talk to lawyers, and I am myself a lawyer. And maybe you've already begun to answer this question, but when, in the context of investing, especially in the purchase of Baby Boomer Tsunami companies, should an investor get legal advice?
From day one, they should seek out an attorney, a law firm, who has, let's say they're considering investing in a certain company. Well, that company is in an industry and has a certain sales volume and so forth. They should find transactional people and legal people who can give them advice on that kind of transaction. It's very complicated. You have NDA, non-disclosure agreements, you have confidentiality agreements, buy-sell agreements. I mean, it goes on and on and on. Sometimes we forget that the seller definitely has an attorney. That attorney for the seller is there to protect the seller. We need as good, if not better, representation on our side as investors. Otherwise, some of these things are going to be skipped because it's very complicated buying a business. It's not like buying a house. It's, well, I mentioned a few of those. So, for example, environmental impact issues. Is everything that I've talked about okay, but now we have an environmental issue with regulators or other entities? Well, we need to have an attorney spike the environmental impact issue before we buy the business. And I'm the same way. You know, it's tough paying those legalese. But I tell you, invest hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars into buying a business as an accredited investor. A good attorney will pay for themselves many times over. And they may be able to, the investor may be able to buy a business at a lower price because they find some things that would otherwise not be disclosed.
Right. They find things that are negative on value and are able to price things accurately, you might say.
For example, are we going to require a covenant not to compete from the sellers? There's nothing worse than buying a business, forgetting that because we don't have good legal representation, and then we find out that the seller now has authority to go out and start a competing business. Well, no, let's talk about that day one, what we're going to do. Well, those things happen, you know, and you know, investors, usually they're not attorneys, and they're not CVAs, they're not certified valuation appraisers, and they're not CPAs, and so forth. And those professionals need to be brought in from day one. Those relationships need to be built and they need to be brought in.
Well, I guess while we're scaring off all the accredited investors, we should probably take a moment to reflect that what we're talking about are businesses that have succeeded. We're not talking about startups. So your likely batting average for making money from these things, once you avoid risks you can identify and avoid, is probably going to be a lot higher. So it may be worth all the trouble, right?
Oh, absolutely. Well, if we're talking about the baby boomer concept, we may be talking about a second or third generational company, first, second, or third generational company. So this is a going concern. It's been in business for probably 2 or 3 decades, and so this is not a startup. On the other hand, some of the business owners are not in the business of dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's in relationship to some of these things we've been talking about, like IP, intellectual property, licenses, environmental impact issues, and so forth. They're just not in the business of doing that. They assume that other people are doing those. Well, what if they're not done? Well, then does the buyer carry the burden? Are receivables collectible? Do we have good relationships with customers, vendors, all these kinds of things? Employees, do we need to have, does an attorney need to write up an employment agreement with key employees that are going to continue with the business? We want to know that up front. We don't want key employees that we want to continue with us to leave and go work for a competitor. We want to have an employment agreement in place and have them locked down. So I'm not here to sell legal work for an attorney. I'm here to help investors, and this is probably some of the best advice I could give them. Day one, a good attorney, talk it over, make a plan, and then follow advice given.
Well, then I'm going to turn the attention away from attorneys to other professionals that it may be penny wise and pound foolish to ignore. Let's just talk about the issue of valuation. Now, an accredited investor who's very savvy will understand there's valuation and there's valuation. You spent some time in your Exit Strategy Handbook discussing valuation with great and I think extremely helpful specificity. There are no less than 7 valuation methods you identify right off the top, and I'll just run through them quickly. The EBITDA method, discounted cash flow, comparable company, comparable transaction, asset accumulation, acquisition debt value, and liquidation value. And any of those, or maybe more than one of those, but any of those will be more appropriate in a given situation, in a given investment situation than another. And just to illustrate the point further, you provide a graphic in your book of a company called Private Co., a hypothetical company. And what's its valuation? Well, the asset market valuation would be $2.4 million. Its collateral value, 2.5. Its insurable value, 6.5. Fair market, 6.8. Of course, fair market, you wonder what kind of market we're talking about. Investment value, and I don't know what that means, is 7.5. Impaired goodwill value, 13 million. Financial markets, 13.7. Owner value, 15.8. Synergy market value, and that's something we haven't talked about in connection with this tsunami. There might be synergies for buying more than one asset or for
a strategic reason to buy, yeah.
Exactly. And then public value, I don't know what that is either, but 18.2. So you're not a hostage to the valuation that's given, but when you're asked to rely on something, you should begin to ask questions and get expert help. Isn't that the case?
That's exactly the case. And my advice is to challenge the assumptions of the appraiser. I'll give you an example. Ernst & Young is a big company. They do a great job. They valued one of my clients for a sale a few years ago. I reviewed the appraised value, looked at their assumptions, just talked it over with them, and lo and behold, they had overvalued the company by about $4 million. Well, that's a big number. When we have an appraisal, we need to challenge the assumptions. We would do that if we were buying a house, right? If we were buying a house and we have an appraiser, we're going to look at comparable houses, and we're going to say, well, you know what, this one, I believe that. To me, it has lower value because I'm going to have to fix it up, or I'm going to have to put in a pool, or I'm going to have to do this or that. And so it's the same logic, even though these things sound complicated. If you hire a good attorney and you have a good appraiser that's on your side to challenge the appraisal, they have the right to do that, in fact, almost the obligation. So, yeah, challenging the assumptions, not just taking it for granted that whatever an appraiser says the value of the company is, no. We take that and then we start chopping away on it.
Of course, it can cut both ways. An appraisal may be too low, and you realize that. I've certainly seen the case in bankruptcy auctions where the expectation was one thing and the result was a great deal better, and worse, but better sometimes too.
And that's why you need a good attorney, because if you're an accredited investor, you're not always obligated to tell the other side that, that's why, because there are things that are legal. And so, you're exactly right. It can go up or down.
So think of the end in view and array your forces accordingly.
Yep, you're exactly right.
All right. Well, Jerry Mills, this has been a very substantive, very brief, but very substantive talk, which is perfect for the medium we've chosen to have our discussion in. I look forward to perhaps doing this again with you at some point.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed the questions and wish the best of luck. I hope this adds value to some of the accredited investors that are listening to it. I hopefully glean one or two things from it perhaps I hadn't considered before.
Well, all right. Well, thank you, Jerry Mills of B2B CFO. For Accredited Investor Markets Radio, this is Christopher Cahill. We're looking forward to your joining with us next time.
Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe through iTunes or Stitcher, or you can download our app from Libsyn. You can also listen right on our website, www.AIMkts.com. Each week, Accredited Investor Markets Radio brings you news and education about investing with a focus on alternative assets. To see a short written summary of this episode, go to www.AIMkts.com. Accredited Investor Markets Radio is a production of Financial Poise Radio Productions, LLC.